Thanks to Sana Skin Studio for supporting the No podcast. Sana is a skin studio that is shifting the relationship with your skin and your products through goal-driven facials, real guidance, and clean skincare. Stay tuned for our promo code so you can receive $25 off of your first facial at Sana Skin Studio. Welcome to the No podcast with me, Nikki Spo. What is up, you guys? Welcome to The No. I am your hostess, Nikki Spo, and I am so glad that you're here. The No is not about knowing everything. It's about knowing ourselves. Yep, we are in the pursuit of finding and celebrating our deepest inner knowing so we can live our most intentional lives. Don't miss a beat. Hit subscribe so the No episodes are automatically downloaded and you get those fun banners every time I drop a new episode, which, if you didn't know, is every Tuesday. That's my plug. Subscribe to my Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube channels, or wherever you are listening to your podcasts. And if you are loving what you hear, it would mean the world to me if you were to rate the show and leave a review. I am really excited about today's guest. One of the most intelligent and creative humans I know, and my former work neighbor, and my general consultant of all things education when I was a new teacher. My good friend, 2021 Teacher of the Year, George Ovalle. George, or Mr. Ovalle to his students, is a graduate of FIU, like your girl, with a degree in English and education, and has been an educator in the city of Miami for over a decade in both public and private schools. He currently teaches drama and English literature at the high school level, and, if you didn't hear me the first time, was awarded the 2021 Teacher of the Year award. George is the co-creator and host of the podcast Searching for McGuffin, where he discusses the driving force behind the stories depicted in art, media, and life while in search for meaning and purpose. In this episode, while we'll definitely talk about education, which is so important to me and so many other parents that I know, we will also be talking about mental health, spirituality, and what I am most interested in is how George is sharing the McGuffin through his podcast. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation with George about, McGuffin in film, art, and media, but really how we are all searching for our own McGuffin, the driving force behind our stories, our why. So without further ado, let's get started with George Ovalle. George, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to be on my show where we pride ourselves on not knowing everything, but at least knowing ourselves.
Yeah, or at
That's
least
what we do here.
Yeah, on the journey to know ourselves.
Exactly. So I already gave my intro about who you are and what we are going to talk about today, but I want you to give us and the listeners a little background on yourself, like where you're from and all that jazz.
I was born in New York City, and I was there for my very younger years, but very early on, we moved here where I'm from, Miami, Florida, and I grew up most of that adolescent youth really digesting art, media, TV, movies, music. I was just drawn to it. I grew up in a home that really prided themselves on this kind of media. My father was a film director in school. He left that to, kind of work a more blue collar job to help us get ahead. But that passion was instilled in me. And a big part of why I think I was drawn to that is to kind of escape the realities of life. For me, that fantasy, those stories that were told, they drew me in, and I was able to exist somewhere else, even if it was just for 22 minutes or an hour and a half, whatever it may be, just reading, watching, or listening to the stories of others, things they've experienced or things that we couldn't even imagine to experience.
I'm pretty sure that I've shared this with you, but my family was really similar. I learned how to paint when I was really young, and they were all about, we would make these, we called them cranking movies. We'd get a cut up box and we would do one of those movies where you drop in the artwork and you tell the story and then you shift it out and you create a plot. And so that was a really big part of my childhood too. And I feel like I can relate to the whole escapism element of it. So, I've talked pretty openly about what I was trying to escape. And there's other episodes for the listeners who want to tap into that, but what realities were you escaping?
I came up with a very a very stern environment, a lot of expectations, um, how to act, how to speak, when not to speak. Most of the time, it was when not to speak. Um, you
Like
know,
very old school.
yes, very old
Like
school. My
kids should be
father,
seen and not heard.
yes, absolutely. My father had me really late in life. It was a second marriage. So I was born and they were already past middle age. So by the time I'm getting into my adolescent years, my teen years, um, it's been a long, arduous road. And those expectations were perhaps passed down from another generation. And I just felt like I couldn't be myself. There was a lot of
In your
expectations.
home.
Yeah, anywhere in my home, in school, in church, and a lot of societal expectations in all my different, you know,
Areas of
communities.
life.
Yeah, all the different areas of life. Absolutely. So this was the one place where like I could have a notebook and I could just write. I could just write poetry. I could write stories. I could draw. I could listen to music, and I could just escape those kind of things. Just the pressure of trying to be someone that I was being expected to be rather than the person that I was.
I can't even like that's the soundbite, right? Like the pressure of
Mm.
being. And I think we all
Mhm.
struggle with that like today even. Like not maybe not all of us, like the people who are doing the inner knowing work and all that stuff that like we're coming to learn ourselves and everything. But I've been there. Like the pressure to just be, like to exist the way you are and like having people not accept that or want you to be a different way and how that can affect our mental health, especially when those pressures have been put on us by our parents, right? And the people who are supposed to love us.
And I think it keeps going. Especially, it's so difficult early on because we're still trying to figure out who we are
Yeah.
and what we want to be. So we're kind of placing our hope in the future, but it doesn't stop as we progress through our lives because the expectations just change. There's expectations placed on us at work. There's expectations that our spouses have. There's expectations that our children have as people when we eventually get, if we get those opportunities. And we just kind of have to realign our perception of being as we move through that journey.
Like I've had a hard time with it like through the years. Like I actually saw something recently that talked about like the pressures, especially for women, like what women are supposed to be. And but you know, a lot more, George, we're learning a lot about like the pressures that are put on men too. Like don't cry, don't have feelings, don't do this, right? Women get a lot of like be quiet, be pretty, be an accessory, don't have a voice, you know. And I think fortunately I think that our society, we're becoming a lot more open and we're having these conversations just like you and I are doing now. So it's good to see. I wish it had happened earlier in time, like before our parents' generation, because you touched on something that it's generational. And I really do believe that it's passed down. Our way of being is passed down from our parents and their parents and so on and so forth.
I don't know what it's like to be a woman, so to speak,
Right.
but for example, listening to your show has been illuminating because you get that perspective not just from yourself but from your guests as well. And having those conversations, you start to understand the experiences that you don't go through and start to relate to something that you didn't understand, but also you see the commonality in the universal experience. And for me growing up, it was the expectations, like you said, to be a man. But when you're inundated with the arts, you love painting, you love music, you love writing. Those aren't really typical, especially when I was growing up, things that you were pushed to do as a young boy growing
Which
up.
is so crazy, George, because like, right. So it's like not a masculine thing, right? Like it's not quote unquote masculine to do those things. But then you look at like all the successful artists, right? Like, and how hard it was for like women to break into the arts and into film and into all of it, right? So it's such like I don't know if catch 22 is the appropriate term here, but it's like, it's not encouraged.
Yeah.
But then all the successful people happen to be, not all, but you know what I mean? Like they're mostly men.
Yeah, it's like the value system becomes inverted. And then there's that also leads to a pressure to succeed because you're not allowed to like this or be good unless you're the absolute best
Yeah.
at it. Yeah, like
Totally. I can totally get that. Like you're not right. If you're going to George Ovalle, if you're going to pursue like writing and poetry, you better believe that you've got to be the best.
Because then it's okay to do it. It's
Right.
okay
If you're
to
amazing at it.
write or to act or to whatever it is that your passion is, only if you're the absolute best and you're amazing of it, because then you'll be above criticism, which we know isn't even true itself.
Well, and it reminds me, it takes me back to our teaching days, which we're going to get to, obviously, but it takes me back to like, remember, I'm sure you still have this today, like kids who didn't study for a test, right? They're like, they have the excuse. So when they fail the test, they're like, oh, but I didn't study anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, but I didn't study anyway. Where it hurts so much more if you actually studied so hard and then you got a C, right? Because then you feel bad about yourself. It's like, how many people are we disservicing by putting these I don't know if it's gender roles or what specifically it is, but these expectations of what people should and shouldn't pursue?
I think gender does play a part in it, absolutely. And I just think it's overall just these kind of like success requirement. And to say that if you don't succeed, then it's not worth doing. It's like you said, we're robbing opportunities, not just of success, but perhaps even of failures, but growth. I can't know whether I'm going to be good at something unless I try it. And even if I'm not good at it, it still might bring meaning. It might be something insightful, or it might be something that I have to work on and eventually find a role in my life, because I truly believe that we're a composite of our experiences, and we're a composite of what we put our energy to. And sometimes it's okay to be okay at something if it gives your life meaning and purpose.
Oh my gosh. That's how I feel about my podcast. I don't know if like where I am on like the spectrum of like podcasters, but like I remember thinking like, oh my God, what if I suck? Like, what if I'm terrible? Like I did a whole podcast on like why I was scared of starting a podcast, right? Like I just didn't even, I would be so mortified if I did it and I was just terrible and people were like, oh, she sucks. She's so bad, But, and like I go back and I listen to like preliminary episodes, like some of the earlier work that I've done, and I'm like, oh, but guess what? Like I've been able to grow and learn from that. And I could tell you today that like if like I could not get paid to do this and I would do it still, you know what I mean? And like I love doing it. I feel like it's helping people in some capacity, and it really brings a lot of meaning to my life. I'm sure you went through some similar experiences or feelings when you're like trying to start a podcast, because starting anything new is scary.
Yeah, I think it's in all facets of my life. You talked about mental health, that struggle. And I know a lot of people suffer from imposter syndrome. I can be a celebrated teacher. I can have this show that I do week in and week out. And I think that almost every morning I wake up and I'm like, am I going to be good at this? And the more that I do it, the more that I understand that I'm growing and getting better at who I am at my core. And I'm not defined by these things that I do, but they definitely give me meaning and purpose. And I can say that I'm at least a pretty decent teacher. I'm a pretty decent conversationalist. But the fact that I keep at it, I know that when I have that struggle mentally between, should I just stop doing this? Like, does anyone want to hear me? Does anyone want to learn from me? Does anyone want to see me? I know that it's not for others in a sense, it's for myself, but also being able to interact, reach out, communicate with others. It also gives me a sense that if you can inspire one person to pick up that mic or to read that book or to, perform that play, whatever
Write
it
a line of
is.
poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. Then I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. And I think that's what others did for me when I was growing up. And to just give back a little bit of that, it's meaningful.
So the soundbite that I'm getting here is like, and that just like hit home for me is you said, I am getting better at who I am at my core every day.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so amazing, and I like think about mental health and like all the ways, George, that I used to feel about myself when I made mistakes. Like I thought I was just so unforgivable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I thought people would never forgive me. I thought that I wasn't worth receiving forgiveness. Do you remember like back in the day when we were both teachers, I used to say, I'm not worth anything. Like I'm not worth, this is so crazy. Like it's going to sound totally batshit, like to the listeners, that I was like, no, nobody deserves anything. Nobody deserves. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I absolutely remember. I remember where we were. I remember the room. I can visualize it right now.
I can visualize it too.
Yeah.
But I legit thought like people are undeserving. Like I went through that weird darkness in my life where I was just like, I don't deserve love. I don't deserve forgiveness, you know, all these things. And it took a lot for me to personally to grow through that and realize that like, of course I deserve those things. And I'm learning still.
I don't know if you remember what I told you that day. Do you remember?
What did you tell me? I mean, you said so many things. Like you're like the most inspiring person I know. So like, which part?
I remember the through line for me was, you do deserve love. You do deserve respect. You did as a child, and you do today. And I think if we can impart that to the people in our lives, that we love them and we accept them for who they are, even in their brokenness, even in their highest achievement, that we can love them and that they're deserving of that love. That's not everybody gets that message, and it's invaluable. Yeah. And if you can internalize that and understand that, it'll help you march through the darkness. I don't think the darkness ever goes away, or at least I haven't experienced it. There's going to be those bouts, but I think as long as you're growing and as long as you're listening, then you can find the strength to keep pushing forward.
First of all, I just got like kind of emotional when you were saying that, but it's like, I heard this quote once, and I mess everything up, but it was like, I reserve the right to be wrong. No, that was actually right. I didn't mess it up. That's the quote. I reserve the right to be wrong.
Yeah.
Like, and make mistakes and like go through it. And, you know, something I've been thinking about a lot is like, no one is bigger than God, right? Like we talk about spirituality, like nobody is bigger than God. And I know that God sees my essence of who I am, my core of who I am. And God, the God of my understanding, forgives my mistakes and allows me grace, right? Gives me that grace to grow and make changes and learn.
God gives us the insight to forgive ourselves. And I think that's even more freeing.
Yeah.
Because it's great to be forgiven, especially if that comes from, you know, whatever concept you have of above, but to be able to internalize that and to understand that for oneself to move forward. Like I said, I think it's invaluable.
Yeah. I think that when we have compassion with ourselves, it makes us 1,000% like just way more compassionate towards other people.
Yeah.
I wish I had learned these things when I was a teacher, because I probably would have been a lot more of a compassionate teacher, you know, back then, and like had a lot more empathy. And that's not to say that I don't think I did. I think I did to an extent, but I mean, even as a parent, like I've learned a lot, you know, like, and being able to forgive myself and then have tolerance for other people.
I remember having the reputation back then of being like the authoritarian in the classroom. You had it too. Yeah. It was like that hallway was the hallway of fear, because they're like, you're going to come to work. You're going to stay on point. And especially when you're starting off, like we were at the time, you need that. You need that in order to create control.
Well, survival too for new teachers.
Yes, absolutely. It's like, if you don't demand respect, then you won't get it given to you.
Especially in an inner city school, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, like you said, over the years, I've grown softer.
Yeah.
And sometimes I even question, maybe too soft, because I don't care so much about the achievement, which sounds weird, right? But I care more about the person. And I've torn up the methodology. I've torn up the plan book, so to speak, over the years, to try to find like, okay, what is relevant now? Where can I reach these group of students where they are right now? And that's kind of hard to like rewrite over and over again.
Every year. And like every class, and you have like 6 different classes that you're teaching and multiple subjects that you're teaching. So what made you decide that you wanted to become a teacher?
I didn't at first. I wanted to be a journalist. That was my passion in high school. I was pretty sure this is what I'm going to do. Then I got it in my head I had to make more money than that. So I looked for a career.
So you looked to be a teacher?
No. First, I decided to go study something that was not my passion.
Okay.
Yeah. So I went to pursue, a career specifically in pre-dental, which I was like, I don't like people's mouths, but I like money, I guess. Those are the expectations. I'm supposed to be affluent. Then I came across.
I'm supposed to be affluent.
Yeah. Then I came across chemistry, and I was like, I don't like this, or I don't think I can do it. But at the same time, I actually had a teacher. I was taking, you have to take English no matter what, right? In university. So I was taking my regular English classes, and I came across a teacher that really brought the content to life, you know? So much of what we do in this life is the grind, and in college it was no different. And you're just doing classes just to get grades, just to get ahead.
Right.
But his class was something that gave me something to look forward to. And I thought, if you could teach it this way, I could do this, you know? And I ended up in programs where I was doing like after school care, and then eventually even like a little drama club just to pay my way through college. And I thought, I could just do this like every day. And I decided to take a step the other way. You know what? Money's not everything. We're notoriously underpaid. Everybody knows that. But you know what? I'm going to go through education. I'm going to do what I'm seeing is effective here, because if you can make that connection with someone and inspire them to pursue whatever it is that they want to pursue, then I want to be a part of that. I want to be able to connect with someone the way that this teacher connected with me.
And it's a long game too, right? Like a lot of the times you don't even know if you're like, if it's hitting, right? You're like, I have no idea if they're absorbing what I'm talking about. Like, could go right over their head. And I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this too, and that you've continued teaching, is that people come around and they tell you the impact that you had on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you don't see it for like
years. Yeah. Right. Like after they graduate, like way after.
And sometimes you don't know. You send them off on their way, and then that's the last. And there's just ships off in across the world and the universe. But I think always, whenever I'm down, whenever I'm like, I don't know if I can keep doing this, because it is hard and it is tough. Yeah. And I don't know if it's worth, all the time and all the effort. Someone always comes along. A student always comes along, either from my past or reaches out in my class. Hey, how can I learn more about this? How can I do this? How can I pursue this? I'll get a student in my drama program who's like, how can I do this after I'm done graduating? Whether that means engaging in local theater or actually, pursuing it as a career. And that inspires me. Like if they need me to push them along that way, then I guess I still got to keep being here. Everyone is different. Every class is different. And you're like, it's just not hitting on all cylinders here. A student will come and be like, hey, can we do this? Hey, can we read this?
Question, right?
And my answer is always like, yeah, why not? Like, let's blow it up. Let's rethink this whole thing. And yes, it's more time. Yes, it's more effort. But you know what? You're going to enjoy it more, and I'm going to enjoy it more. And I think we're going to be better off because of it.
This conversation is so good, but before we keep going, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsors, Sana Skin Studio. The best way for me to describe Sana is that it feels like coming home. Unlike traditional facials, Sana's facials are rooted in education, and I love this so much. Every experience I've had at Sana has been a chance to learn more about my skin and its needs. I love that the facials are effective while also being accessible enough to be a monthly ritual rather than a yearly splurge. I'm honored to be able to provide our audience with a promo code. Use the code THENOGLOW for $25 off of your first facial at Sana when booking via sanaskinstudio.com. The ELA, the English Language Arts, English Lit, that was inspired by your college professor.
Yeah.
And the drama?
The drama's just always been a passion for me. Like you said, a lot of movies. Movies probably the backbone of it. And then when I was young, I was exposed to live theater. They had a lot of great programs here. They had a lot of small independent theaters, many which have fallen to the wayside. But a lot of programs were like, with $10, I could scrounge up and get into like a Shakespeare show. And there was only 50 of us in the small, rest in peace, the New Theater and theaters like that. And by being exposed to that stuff, I understood how literature can come to life in a real setting. And I know that movies are like this generation, not this generation, probably the past 100 years or so, like our new theater, so to speak. But there's something about being in the room with the person in live action that is incomparable. It's different listening to an album, on Spotify or Apple Music than being there in the room at the concert. And live theater is that. Yeah, seeing those stories come to life. where I was able to understand those plays that we read in English classes. Like, they don't make sense on a textbook. It doesn't make sense to read a play. It must be seen. So we do it from an academic perspective. But when I take those kids on their first play and some of them tell me, I would have never come to a live play. And I'm always worried how they're going to respond. Like, if it's a Shakespeare play, is it going to be too old? Are they going to be too confused? Is it about a topic from another time, another place? But they always connect with it because they're there. They're transported to that place.
It's almost like, so Shakespeare's hard to read, right? For most people, I think. So if you're watching a show in Spanish, right, and you don't speak Spanish, but you're watching it and you're picking up on their mannerisms, you're like, maybe I don't know exactly what they're saying, but like the vibe over here, like I see the mannerisms, I see the connection, I see the emotions that they're like presenting. And you're like, I understand the story. So like, it's kind of like that. If you're reading Shakespeare on paper, you're like, what?
Mm-hmm.
You go see it and you see how they're literally acting towards each other. And you follow along and you're like, oh, that means that. Okay.
Yeah.
That means that.
It just clicks. And I tell them every year, don't worry. I don't understand what it says either. I'm very fluent. I understand the language, but sometimes there's pieces of the script where it's like, this is the 8th year that I've read this play in a row. And that's what that means. Because in reality,
totally.
Yeah, it's a different time. It's a different place. I don't speak the language of that time.
Yeah.
But the stories that we tell, they're relevant and they're transcend time and place, because the human experience, as wide and diverse as it is, it's singular. It doesn't matter where you come from socioeconomically, nationality, geographically, or throughout time. At the end of the day, we all have to worry about many of the same things. We need to work to eat. We want to find love. We need to find value in ourselves, and we need to come to terms with the environment around us.
Searching for McGuffin.
Yeah.
Right? We're searching for this. Like, so talk about your show. Like, I didn't know what a McGuffin was the other day when we were talking about it until you articulated it. So let's talk about that.
I kind of had this idea for a show, and as times changed and technology changes, the format of it changed. It's like, is it a talk show? But when podcast came, I was like, I can do this. I can talk, because not that I'm an eloquent speaker or that my voice is so important to be heard, but I do this. I engage in conversations daily with people. And the McGuffin it's a film term. It's the thing in the script that moves the action along. Think the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, or the Ark of the Covenant in Indiana Jones. Those are some of the more cliche, more obvious ones. But my question that I had always asked is, what is that thing that drives us forward? What's the McGuffin in our lives? And in season 1 last year, my goal was to figure out what that was. We go through a lot of media. We go through TV, movies. We try to keep up with what's new, but we also look back at the things that kind of shaped us, because like I said, a lot of this media, it shapes who we are. It's just like the Greeks created plays to determine what their government and what their morality was going to be like. Our media, our music, it does that as well. And it's not just something that informs us, but it's also a mirror to ourselves, because it's a reflection of what our value systems are, right? We create something that represents our stories. And I wanted to explore that a little bit. And throughout season 1, if someone goes back and listen to it, we're kind of looking for what that is. And I think by the end of season 1, what we came to is that central idea was, we kept coming back to it over and over. It was hope. And I think a lot of the media that we consume, a lot of the movies, the music, the art forms, the books that we read, it kept redirecting me to hope. So for season 2, that was kind of our emphasis, finding the hope. And where do we find our hope? See, it's still a McGuffin, because it's still a question mark. For everyone, it's different.
And what? Even when you're just saying that, I'm like, and what is hope for what? Hope for what?
Yeah. And I think what we have hope for, and what drives us to have hope, what instills us to have hope, that's different per person, for every individual. So we look at all these stories and we're like, what is driving the characters here? and why do we connect with it or don't connect with it, right? If I watch a movie, if I read a book and I'm like, yeah, that wasn't really for me. What was it? What was it that their story doesn't resonate with us? Or what is it about their story that does? And I think that once we start to understand the diversity in experiences, we reach that point of catharsis. And that's always a big thing that I'm always bringing up in my classes. I like preach it from freshman year. And then I still have obviously senior students who are like, what are you talking about? And I was like, you've had me multiple times. But that idea of taking those emotions and expelling them out by the end of that breaking point at the end of a story, we see ourselves or we learn from that which we had not been exposed to before.
I don't know what that says about me, like in the fact that I'm obsessed with murder mysteries and psychological thrillers, but something you said about like, these expelling of these emotions. Obviously like we've had so many conversations over the years, and I know that you and I are similar in this ways that we have big feelings, right? And those big feelings, like we touched on a little bit, it can be difficult at times. Do you think that it has made you a better teacher, especially with English lit and drama?
I kind of live my life with the central idea of paradox. I think it has made a better one, and it has made me a worse one. And I think that the same is true of being a person. Big feelings. Big feelings are great if they can be redirected into a positive place. So am I sometimes too passionate, maybe too impatient, expecting too much change, placing high expectations? I think perhaps. And I think that drives me to strive for better. But sometimes you just have to accept you can't do it all. But I do think that those being able and to be open with oneself, with one's thoughts, and being able to accept, well, we're not always going to agree on everything. And that's okay because you have your story and your journey. And sometimes our roads will converge and sometimes those roads will divide.
So like part of, my brand, when I talk about all the time, is like I like to call it truth speaking and storytelling. And they kind of sound like two different things, like telling the truth but telling a story, right?
Yeah.
But there is great power, I believe, in storytelling. And you even touched on it when you were talking about your college professor and how that professor really brought the content to life, right? In a way that was able to like hit home with you. Let's talk about the power of storytelling.
Well, I think story, that term itself, we look at lots of different things and we think of stories. Sometimes when people hear story, they think something made up, right?
Fairy
They don't,
tale, fiction.
yeah, right. And they don't, or perhaps they haven't been exposed to the idea that I think everything that we speak is a story. The story of our lives are also stories, and they operate in the same way that fictional stories take place. Sometimes fiction is a great way to tell your story because it serves as an allegory. Sometimes it's too difficult to bear your all, to stand in the audience of the universe and just be there unclothed, So you kind of not hide, but interpret through narrative in a different way. And I think that these stories, they help us shape our stories. All of our lives, there's a truth to it and there's a reality objectively, but it requires interpretation from the individual. My life looks very different from the outside than it does from my perspective. And yeah, and I think we have to find a way to live with our story the way that we understand it. That doesn't mean creating some fictionalized version of it, but being able to listen to the commentary, the criticism of people who care for us, who love us, and who support us, and be able to internalize that. But at the end of the day, to objectively define what we understand as our narrative or our story, because our truth, even if it is objective, no one has all the answers, no one has all the facts, and it's also a work in progress.
Well, as objective as anybody wants to be, I think that like there's multiple perspectives that you can come at it from. Like I remember, discussing my childhood with my dad and other family members where I'm like, this is what I experienced, and people would flat out be like, that's not what happened,
Mhm.
right? And I don't think it's like intentional gaslighting. I think it's that from their perspective, that's not how they saw it.
Yeah, you mentioned murder mysteries
Yeah.
earlier. You'll notice that happens, right? We're trying to
Right.
reconstruct the scene. Everyone has a
Mhm.
different version of it.
Yes.
They're not lying. They just experienced it in different ways. And
Yeah.
until you're able to compile those together, compare, contrast, and understand what is real, what isn't, and what's subjective. Sometimes there's not a right answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes both your perspectives are valid, and it's just the means of interpretation. Then we start to get a kind of fuller picture of what our experience is.
So this is part of why I believe it's so important for people to like come to terms with their own realities, right? And like really just it takes a lot of patience and practice and self reflection to come to a place where they can understand their journey, like their own journey, right? So
Mhm.
that they can see how it's impacted them. And also, like, it takes guts because it's really easy to have somebody else tell you how you experience something. And you'd be like,
Right.
oh, yeah, that's the truth. Like, I remember something happened in my childhood, and it was something that, like, everybody joked about. And so it was like a story we wound up telling for years that was like a funny story. And it wasn't until much later that I was like, oh, that shit was not that funny. Like, that actually really
Yeah.
affected me and impacted me in a really big way
Mhm.
that I didn't get to address until I was an adult.
Yeah. I think sometimes there's the trauma in our lives, and we either downplay it. For me, it's like being sardonic, being I guess, not self-loathing, but kind of like self-deprecating, to hide the real hurt and to hide the real, doubt that's inside of you. But as you grow older, you start to kind of reshape and rethink. And the reality is that you understand a moment at 16 way differently than you do at 26 and 36. And
Yeah.
I think telling your story sometimes requires revisions and edits,
Oh my
not to
gosh. Yeah.
change, not to change what happened, but to change how you understand and inform who you are, because your understanding grows.
I'm working on like not letting my sobriety define me, right? Because I'm
Mhm.
like, that's for in April I'll have 3 years of sobriety, consecutive sobriety. And I'm like, I identify so heavily as a sober woman. I'm like, but that's just part of a much larger picture. And
Right.
I'm not limiting myself to being just that and having that be like the McGuffin of my story. It's not the only
Yeah.
thing. Like, there's multiple sometimes, like
Mhm.
there's a lot in it. It's jam
Yeah.
packed, and be able to like revise my story, like, just I feel like you just gave me permission to do that. And I think what I think a lot of my podcast is giving people permission
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
feel, act, or do
Because we talked
whatever.
about, not feeling allowed to be who we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
Many times it's us who does
Yeah.
that. We
Yeah.
do that to ourselves.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to be who you are because you think you
Right.
should be someone or something else.
Totally.
Yeah, being able to recontextualize who you are, it's exactly like you said. We're a composite of influences. We're a
Yeah.
composite of experiences, and not just defining ourselves by being a mother, being a
Right.
teacher, being whatever it is. I know
Right.
you've alluded to it in the past. Something that I always told you, I want to be doing something different, every 10 years. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, I said that 10 years ago, I was a teacher. I'm still a teacher now, but I'm doing this as well. And doing this show is a new experience. And I don't know where one road ends and another one veers off in another direction, but just being able to reevaluate your life constantly, and consider not putting all your eggs in one basket, because unfortunately tragedy strikes, the world changes like it did just a few years ago, and
Yeah.
the things that we do every day that we think define us, they just vanish.
Going back to your podcast,
Yeah.
let's talk about your audience. Who is your audience?
Okay. Well, I would love to say that everyone is my audience, right?
Right.
But as I always tell the students, there's always a target audience, right?
Yeah.
So, I think it's, especially when you go through all the analytics and you look at who's actually listening, who's
Yeah.
actually watching.
You go back end.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to say my show is open for anyone,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's a lot of the people who grew up, surrounded by these kind of stories and this kind of media, which is increasingly more and more people as time
Right.
passes. When I was a kid, you were kind of like picked on and like pushed aside. for being into this kind of stuff. Oh, you
Mm-hmm.
watch TV, you collect figures, you whatever it is, but I think it's become mainstream. So I think that what audience is widened. I do the show with a couple of younger people, so I'm about to hit 40-ish soon. Not to age myself, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I have co-hosts that are in their 20s and in their 30s. So I think that like 20 to 40 range,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's our main audience. I think it's mostly guys, which is interesting to be on this show, right? Which I think
Yeah.
your audience is mostly female, but it's mostly male just because, again, those societal expectations to kind of push guys. It's okay to be into this kind of stuff. It's
Right.
okay to watch and to tell and like to kind of shape part of your identity around these things. But I think anyone who has resonated with the stories that they've read and watched and listened to and internalized those and kind of defined who they are, at least on some aspect. Again, not in their entirety. I don't see myself as that's who I am. But anyone who connects with those kind of things, who's there on opening night, who binges the season that
Yeah.
first weekend,
Right.
who gets that book right away and reads or listens to it, within that first week. I think that's our audience, the one
Yeah.
who they make the time to make this part of their lifestyle.
So, okay. So you mentioned that the first season of Searching for McGuffin was really about the way I interpreted it was that you're identifying what the MacGuffin is per film or whatever it is that you're talking
Mhm.
about on that episode,
Yeah.
right? And then as you move into season 2, you're looking at hope as a whole.
Yeah. I
What's
think
next
what
for the podcast in season 2?
in season 2, well, I think some of the things that we've discussed is season 1 was like, I have a voice. I should get it out there.
Yeah.
And after hundreds of hours of audio, I think you come to the realization of like, maybe I shouldn't talk as much. I think I've exhausted every idea that I had. So for season 2, it was like, okay, we found that MacGuffin. We found that we're in search of hope, especially in the new year. Many times we look for these kind of place markers in our life to reassess and evaluate and create new goals so we can be better people. So in this new season, it's like, let's go out there and let's find out what drives other people. So we're
Mm.
looking at communicating with different people, getting their feedback, having them on the show. And even when it's just us, the hosts, just exploring not just, okay, what's going on in this movie, in this show, in this animated series, but what's going on in us in
Mm.
relation to it. So instead of,
Like, why does it hit?
going exactly, why does it hit? Instead of going just, an hour on one piece of media, more using that as a backdrop to explore ourselves. Because what is the thing that's driving us in this direction? Rather than just the stories that we tell, how does it shape and inform our story?
I feel like this comes full circle, George, because like in a lot of ways, like we have very, very different shows,
Yeah,
but I feel like we're doing something very similar for
absolutely.
our audience, the people that we are catering our podcast to. Like
Yeah.
I like to think that my podcast is for everybody also. Like it's obviously like geared towards women my age-ish,
Mhm.
moms, people who might be super curious, like whatever. Like, but I think what we're doing is something again, like just very, very similar. And that's part of why I wanted to have you on the show and have like a really inspiring male voice, bring something to light that is very much universal.
I can't explain how many times I've listened to an episode of your show and then sent it to someone who's not in the target audience,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like, you need to understand this for yourself, or you need
That
to
means a lot to me.
understand, yeah, you need to understand this, like in your relationship with your mother, with your sister,
Wow.
with
Right.
your wife, because it's been illuminating to me. And even like you said, the times that I've listened to an idea and I'm like, I want to talk about that on my show in
Yeah.
my way, in my relation,
Yeah.
because it might not be exactly what you're talking about, but it's exactly what what I'm thinking about talking about. Because, like I said, those experiences are universal. The details change from person to person, but we go through so much love, loss, hope, death, whatever it is that we struggle with. those are the things that we have to talk our way through them. And it informs not just your show to my show, everyone's show, but it also informs our experience and our connections in other facets of our lives. Like doing this show, even if, it's something I'm not doing in 5 years or it pivots to something else. I've already become better at my day job as a teacher because we have this thing called the honors projects, right? And they used to be book reports. Now they're world building in a video game, or they're creating a podcast series throughout the year. And now I understand that process more and more because I've experienced it. So I can be like, this is how you do it. Or if you have any questions, either I know the answer or I'll find the answer for you and I'll grow in that experience as well. And I have students who have written an entire book over the course of a year as their honors project, who have built a game world, who have had a continuing series of their own podcast published, and they walk out with something that they've created, their story, they've put it out in the world, and it's there now. And that's an opportunity that I didn't have growing up that I would have loved to. And to be able to have someone motivate us, if I can say that, or at least require you for your grade to do that. I think it's a fantastic opportunity.
Well, George, thank you so much. I mean, this has been so awesome. I'm so grateful that I get to share you with everybody, like you and your wife, Gisela, who I also love. I mentioned her in my intro of you, that you guys are a powerhouse duo, flip-flopping Teacher of the Year awards at your school. It's an honor to know you both. And I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to have you on my show.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, she's the strength that helps me get up in the morning when I'm like, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to quit everything. She drags me out of bed and gives me that motivation. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I look forward to returning the experience very soon.
This podcast was brought to you by Sana Skin Studio. Be sure to use my code, TheNoGlow, for $25 off of your first facial at Sana when booking via sanaskinstudio.com. More than a skin studio, Sana is a movement towards healthier skin and self-love. Thank you so much for listening to The Know. If you loved this episode, go ahead and share it with a friend. Words are so powerful, and someone may need to hear what we covered today. And if you really loved this episode, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review. Your comments are so important and valued, and they give other listeners insight on what to expect on The Know. You can connect with me personally via Instagram at Nikki Spo and The Know with Nikki Spo. My hope for you today is that you are fearless in looking inward so that you can be your highest, most authentic self and go after the life of your dreams.